Hello, all you textual deviants, and welcome to another episode of Texting. I'm Mark Will in Taipei.
And I'm Vince Lombardi in St. Petersburg.
He's making a joke, people. He says he's Vince. He's Vince Lombardi, erstwhile coach of the Green Bay Packers.
I'm
But
impressed
the
you knew that.
reason, what's that?
I'm impressed you knew that.
Of course I know that. Why wouldn't I know that?
I know it's pop culture, but you're not like a massive sports guy, so.
I'm not?
I
You
don't
don't
know.
know me at all, do you?
Do you follow sports like now?
Not anymore, but that's ancient history. That's old school sports.
Okay.
Give me a trivia question. Football, baseball, basketball. Go.
All right. Who was the Phoenix Suns point guard the year that they went to the championship against the Bulls?
I know this. Kevin Johnson.
My favorite player. That's why I say that.
Kevin Johnson.
Yeah, good job.
All right, so he's making a joke, people, Vince Lombardi, because our text today is the documentary Mark Lombardi, Death-Defying Acts of Art and Conspiracy. This is a documentary from 2011. This, by the way, is Texting Season 3, Episode 5. And I'm calling this episode All the Best Artists Are Conspiracy Theorists. I don't know if that's really true, but I think the title has a nice ring to it. So if you're watching the video version of this, you can see the slide features one of the artist, Mark Lombardi's drawings, diagrams. We'll talk about how to describe his work as we continue. But first,
interestingly, that diagram that you have featured there is probably the most aesthetically appealing of any that I've seen, just because of how symmetrical and just
looks like
impressive
a
that
globe.
circle is. Yeah, I hadn't seen that before, so that's pretty cool.
I think this might be the one called Global Networks, appropriately enough, because it looks like a globe. But anyway, if you're watching, you can see this lovely picture of Mark Lombardi. He was born in 1951, and he died perhaps by his own hand, and perhaps not, in 2000, just before 9/11. And in many ways, his work is prophetic because he foresaw, as he documented all of these strange relationships among global finance and international terrorism. He foresaw, in a way, a lot of what happened on 9/11 and thereafter. But as you can see here, one of his mottos was, "I collect information." That's what he would say about himself when he was describing what he did. And the title of the documentary, Death-Defying Acts of Art and Conspiracy, that's taken from his business card. When he would introduce himself, he would give people his business card. It was, partially in jest, I guess, but it's actually an apt description of what he did. Death-defying acts of art and conspiracy.
You just reminded me of how we had business cards in Seoul for Koreality.
True, that's right.
Mine were sick. I can't remember your design, but the one I had two different versions, and I loved both of them.
Yeah.
You made one too, right?
Yeah, I had business cards for sure. I think I used some of Sujong's artwork, and then like the Co-Reality logo. So yeah, you should always have a business card, whatever your trade, and especially if you're involved in death-defying acts of art and conspiracy.
And you should stare at it respectfully when you receive it for a while and say,
And
Don't just
yes,
put it in your pocket casually.
in Asia, you should always hand it over with both hands, and you should receive it with both hands and bow. And yeah. All right, so that's Mark Lombardi. I sometimes want to call him Mark Kostabi because there's another contemporary American artist by that name. So um, he's from New York originally. He studied at Syracuse
Syracuse, yeah.
University. Yeah, but he ended up in Houston, which of course is my hometown, and like his mentor at Syracuse University, I believe, took a job at the Contemporary Arts Museum in Houston, a place I've been to numerous times. You can see the picture of it here. It's an ugly building, but
It's not that bad.
I'm pretty sure that in the late 80s or perhaps early 90s, I saw one of his works here. I can't be sure. I wasn't able to locate it online. I'm not sure that they ever had his work displayed here, but I know that there's at least one museum that shows his work, and I want to say that I saw one of his um, artworks here at the Contemporary Arts Museum in Houston, and I remember um, being surprised that he was calling out all of these famous people, powerful people, and at the time it was like, I think it was during the presidency of George H.W. Bush, the original head of the Bush crime family. Actually, I think that goes back to Prescott Bush, but anyway, the one that was CIA and then became president before his idiot son became president. But I remember seeing like
Putin said he was
documentation
no
of
idiot.
what's that?
Putin said he was no idiot.
Yeah, that's the thing I like least about his interview with Mr. Tucker, Tucker this and Tucker that. Um, but anyway, he documented the power relations among all of these elites, and I was impressed by that. And I do remember seeing his one at least one of his artworks in person. I think it was at Contemporary Arts Museum, but it could have been another museum in Houston. So that's my personal connection to this. And I didn't know who he was. And I think I discovered this documentary, 3, 4, 5 years ago. Someone posted it on Facebook of all places and looked interesting. And then I realized I know this guy. I've seen his work before. So that's why I picked it.
But your only exposure would have been here.
In Houston, you mean?
Yeah.
Well, to the work itself, yeah. And I just remember, like, at a contemporary art exhibition, I saw some of his work. I saw like these diagrams
Mm.
showing relations among all these powerful people, and then I didn't, if I read the name of the artist, I had long since forgotten it because it was.
But I mean, so you unquestionably saw them because you recognized it.
I'm certain, in retrospect, I'm certain that was his work. Like once I
Okay, because it
watched
seemed
the
like you weren't
documentary.
100% sure.
No, I'm not 100% sure which museum I saw it in. But
Right, so that's what I'm saying. So what were the options? What are the options for where
well,
else you could have...
it could have been one of the other museums in Houston. I mean,
I see.
there's a museum district in Houston, and so there's the Menil Gallery, which we talked about before in our Picasso episode. There's another contemporary arts museum. There's the Museum of Fine Arts Houston, which is basically across the street from Contemporary Arts Museum, or used to be. So I think it was here. I think it was in this ugly warehouse-looking building,
Again, to the
and
architects, it's not that ugly.
well, that everyone has their own preference, I guess. But I'm not impressed by the building. But I'm reasonably certain that was his work I saw. But I
Okay.
didn't realize that until I watched the documentary a few years ago, and that's when I made that connection. Oh yes, I remember being impressed by these, large scale diagrams showing all these power relations.
And
So
any reason that has he been in your consciousness in the last several weeks to make you choose this as an episode topic, or you just it's been on your mind to feature him for a while and now you finally had a chance?
um yeah, you're asking why I picked this particular text. I had
At
him
this
on a
particular
list
time,
of
yeah. Mm.
well, I just had him on a list of texts that I mean, I had this documentary on a list of texts that I might want to discuss with you at some point, and then, you told me you preferred this to some of the other options I gave you, so here we are.
Here we are.
Yeah. So I wanted to talk about some of his influences. Apparently, Chomsky was important to him in his college days. Like uh, one of his professors, I think he helped organize a like an art installation on Watergate when Watergate was going on,
Right.
and Lombardi talks about how all of his information is public information, and Chomsky has said that too. Like he um, writes his essays and delivers his lectures on, you know, things that he clips out of the newspaper. Like he reads the New York
Out of the New
Times,
York
and
Times.
he just uses readily available public information and tries to uh, piece, put the pieces of the puzzle together.
Can I sidetrack you?
Yeah.
Just speaking of the New York Times, since this is timely, a lot of people have been commenting on their framing of the most recent massacre in Gaza as
Mm-hmm.
they've characterized it as a chaotic incident, right? As opposed to designating any type of onus on Israel. And then somebody lampooned it by rephrasing the 9/11 rephrasing 9/11 with similar language. So like in a chaotic incident, two airplanes hit the World Trade Center, killing, hurting millions or thousands. And it's yeah, it's insane how
Well, the Gray Zone recently debunked the whole mass rape story that the New York Times
mm,
ran with, without verifying sources. I mean, the
right.
one of the supposed rape victims, her family denied that it happened, and New York Times said yes, it did. And one of the contributors to the article was like, you
A
know,
food guy.
uh, IDF. Well, I don't know about that, but
That's
the
not
the the one of the female contributors, I think her name is Anat Schwartz. She's like military intelligence, Israeli military
right.
intelligence, and she liked tweets saying, kill them all and Nakba 2.0 or whatever. So very embarrassing for them, and yet no, they will suffer no consequences because, as has often been pointed out, when you lie at the behest of the establishment, you never suffer the consequences. So anyway, what's his name? Mark Lombardi's art is based on public information. He does, a lot of research, and sketching is how he described what he does. He researches power relations and sketches them. And so
Yeah,
this
can I
is
read you
also
one very
related.
short quote?
Please.
What?
Yeah.
Sure. He just says he's being questioned about the possibility that he might come to an unsavory end, and
Mm-hmm.
his response is, "It's all public information. I'm just reprocessing it. I'm rearranging it into a visual format that's meaningful to me, and for him, it's one way to map the political and social terrain in which I live."
Yeah. Well, sometimes the connecting of those dots is the greatest crime, right? Like he's a kind of visual investigative journalist. Are we having connectivity issues here?
It seems okay again.
All right. I don't know what's going on. Um, so this is also related to Michel Foucault's notion of the archive, and Mark Lombardi also was a librarian and archivist, and that's another thing that interests me about his work. Like he's a documentarian.
Do you feel like you have similar tendencies?
Absolutely, yeah. And some of the writers that I'm influenced by, Sebald comes to mind. You know, um, he's kind of an archivist in a literary sense. So,
I mean, I remember
yes,
you
absolutely. I think
taking
I think
photos so
documentation
meticulously
is an
when we
important
were in
part of
Russia.
my aesthetic program.
But I was just going to say, yeah, like I remember how almost obsessive you were about taking pictures of everything on our trip to Russia. Are there other things in your life that you approach with that same type of meticulousness?
Well, yeah, all my trips, I'm documenting, photographically and graphically, I guess you could say. I'm
What about in
journaling,
other
taking
areas of
notes.
life?
What's that?
What about in other areas of life, when like non-traveling related? I mean, the
Absolutely.
podcast is one example, I guess, and your
Yeah.
blog posts and
This is a
stuff.
this
But
is a form of documentation also. Yeah, and another influence is Herbert Marcuse's notion of art and liberation. So art is kind of um repurposed for, I don't know, revolutionary thinking and propaganda in a way. Although I mean there's not like an overt propagandistic um quality to Lombardi's work, I wouldn't say, but by examining these power relations, he's inviting the viewer to question and critique those power relations, wouldn't you say?
okay, let's go back. Chomsky, okay.
Mm-hmm.
Foucault, I don't know if it's because of the whiskey I'm drinking or what, but you mentioned Foucault's archive. Did you go into
Mm-hmm.
what the archive meant for him? If you did, don't bother explaining, and I will listen back. But if you didn't, can you expand on that a little bit?
Well, this is just mentioned in the documentary. He was inspired by Foucault's notion of the archive. Um, I couldn't tell you exactly what uh, Foucault has to say about the archive, but I know that like one of his favorite works of literature was Flaubert's Temptation of Saint Anthony, which is just kind of like a source book. Like it includes um it's kind of like an archive in itself. Like it draws from a multitude of sources, and like everything is archived everything related to Saint Anthony and his time is included in the book. So you've got multifarious sources, and there's like this need to document every single thing related to the topic at hand.
Okay. And can you dumb down your explanation of the Marcuse again and maybe provide a bit more background?
Well, I think Marcuse is sometimes characterized as a cultural Marxist. So he believed that art and culture should be revolutionary in order to effect revolutionary change socially.
And Art and Liberation is an essay?
I think that's the title of one of his books.
Okay. What
There's
nationality
like
is this
art
person?
as revolution. He's a philosopher.
What nationality? German American.
I
Herbert
think he was part
Marcuse,
of
yeah?
that Frankfurt school in
Ah, yeah, he
Germany,
was. Frankfurt School of
but
Critical
I might
Theory.
be mistaken about that.
Okay. Sorry to put you on the spot for some of this
Okay,
stuff.
and yeah, well, then another important influence is panorama or panoramic painting, and there's just one example here of a Chinese panorama where you get like a 360 view of some scene, and you know some of Lombardi's works have that quality too, like they're large scale drawings or diagrams, and they give like an overview of an entire situation or topic or series of relationships. Let's say panorama is like all seeing, all view, right? So
The documentary tried to kind of, seemed to me, it make the argument that Lombardi's work was like a natural descendant of classic, almost like Renaissance frescoes. Did you did you buy that? Was that a particularly cogent argument for you?
there was that one critic saying that he seems to be part of the conservative tradition of history painting. I mean, perhaps theoretically, but you compare, we're looking now at one of his most famous pieces, BCCI. Oh, I put one too many C's in there, I think. BCCI ICC. This is 1972 to 91, fourth version. This is one of his most famous works, and it's pretty blurry, but you can see like the influence of the panoramic painting school, right? Like you get a
Right.
massive view, almost like the documentary makes comparisons to Picasso's Guernica, which came up in our Picasso's Weeping Woman episode from season 1, was it? Maybe season 2.
That was
But
one of the more interesting sections of the documentary, I thought. Just the whole story about
how so?
what happened, or just the section when they discussed how they had to cover the Guernica when Colin Powell was trying to sell the Iraq War.
Well, we had talked about that during that Picasso episode. It's not clear why that's in this documentary though, because he was already dead before 9/11 and the Iraq War. What were they just trying to show that he had like documented all these relationships, or I don't know.
I guess so. I just think, or how arguably anti-war art. I mean, not arguably in Guernica's case, but maybe how political art is treated by the establishment,
Mm-hmm.
and maybe they were linking that to potential dangers that entered Lombardi's life. But I
Yeah.
agree, it was tenuous, and it was interesting just because it's stuff that we know well. We have a relationship to Guernica. We have an emotional response to the Iraq War. But yeah, beyond that, I agree. And I wouldn't even say that this documentary was fantastic, but
Yeah, it's just informational. I mean,
right,
it's not like a Werner Herzog
right.
documentary, which is great art. So it's just information about the guy and his life, um, and discusses his relations with his colleagues and contemporaries. We'll talk about that later. But as I say, this image is pretty blurry. I just wanted to show like the whole thing so you get that panoramic vision. But here's a detail, and you can see their lines and circles, um, black on white paper with some red. So this is the style. And the topic of this particular piece is the BCCI, the Bank of Credit and Commerce International, which Whitney Webb talks a lot about in her One Nation Under Blackmail book. But this was a bank that laundered money for drug dealers and, was involved in Iran Contra. They had ties to intelligence agencies throughout the world.
Did that
Um,
scene from Scarface come to mind for you? When they had like the music going, the money was just pumping, and
which
this
one?
bank that the bank that finally kind of agreed to work with him. I just imagined
When's
that
that?
this was the type of bank that, what's the character's name? It's slipping my mind right now.
Tony Montana?
Yeah, that Tony Montana would have been working with someone like some company like this, and just
Well,
yeah,
but this is even more nefarious because it's like they're not just laundering drug money, they're like working with intelligence and arms dealers, and you know it's like the nexus of organized crime, um, intelligence agencies, blackmailing operations, and so on.
yeah, it's the
So
same general hustle though.
before, my point is that before Whitney Webb did her investigative journalism, he was documenting these relationships visually, you know, in his art. So let's for those that aren't watching the video, let's try to describe what this art looks like. It's been characterized as intricate patterns of curved arcs that sometimes look like clouds. Um, he's connecting the dots, showing links between global finance and international terrorism, as I mentioned before, is showing uses and abuses of power. And it's been described as information design, a kind of schema, and perhaps most importantly, and I think Lombardi himself described it this way, these are narrative structures that he is representing graphically. So, anything you want to say about that?
Yeah, I've heard his images compared to sociograms. Did you hear that term?
Sociograms, no. Um, I
So a
wasn't.
sociogram is a graphic
I didn't see that.
representation.
I didn't see that.
It's a graphic representation of social links that a person has. It's a graph drawing that plots the structure of interpersonal relations in a group situation. It's kind of like the whole 7 degrees of Kevin Bacon idea. You just lots of circles, lines connecting them. You know this person, well, that person knows this person, and it's almost like a horizontal family tree. Whereas we usually think of a family tree just kind of trickling down like a Christmas tree, but these tend to kind of more veer sideways. So
Well,
not the
that's a
same
good
top
term to
down.
know, sociogram. I
Yeah.
I was also thinking they're kind of like mind maps,
Yes.
right?
Yep.
Like
I love a mind map.
or spider diagrams,
Yep.
spider
Spidergrams.
diagrams in mathematics.
I love mind maps. Whenever I assign
All right,
mind
let's
maps to my
carry on.
students, I'm always jealous because I'm like, I want to do the damn mind map. Something seems very satisfying about it.
Yeah. Hmm. Well, so if we can think of them as narrative structures, then the nouns, the proper nouns, or the names, um, interact with one another through what one critic calls the verbs in the painting, and these are the linking lines. So you've got all these names, most of which are circled, it seems, although maybe not always. So you've got these proper nouns, or names, and then the relationships, the narrative, as it were, the action, um, is described by these linking lines. So the linking lines are the verbs in the narrative.
And they go on to describe,
And
to say
um,
that 6 to 8 types of these linking lines. Oh, you're going to get into that now. Sorry.
say it again.
I think you're going to cover it right now, but I was just going to say, yeah, there are 6 to 8 types of these linking lines.
Right. And so I'll try to describe these for those that aren't watching, but you've got like a solid line with one arrow going one direction, and this indicates some type of influence or control. And then you've got a solid line with uh, arrows on either side, two arrows, and that shows some type of mutual relationship or association. So if you've got, you know, one arrow pointing unidirectionally from one person to another, then, the person pointed at is the one being controlled or influenced by the other person, right? But if there's mutual relationship, then you've got arrows pointing in either direction. So then we've got a broken line with an arrow, and that shows flow of money, loans, or credit. So financial relations are an important part of what he's documenting, especially with BCCI, right? Like that's all about money. And then you've got a kind of jagged line with an arrow, which shows sale of transfer or sale or transfer of an asset. And sometimes the transaction is blocked or incomplete. And so you've got a line with these two perpendicular lines kind of in opposition to the solid line. And then finally, there is a kind of squiggly line with an arrow showing sale or spin-off of property. So anything you want to say about that? I like this because it's like he created his own language. Like you can decode it.
Yeah, I agree. I was impressed. For some reason, right now, I was thinking just about the first 2 lines. So obviously, the first line, the
Mm-hmm.
unidirectional one, is more hierarchical, and the second one is more symbiotic. But I was just trying to imagine what type of relationship would be strictly parasitical, because even if someone has control over you, unless they're like imprisoning you, in a way, it's still you're benefiting if you're getting paid. So I guess I'm just saying, if you're
Yeah, the
my
master is the slave of the slave.
yeah, I'm just saying, if you're my Saudi overlord telling me to do something, but you're paying me handsomely, then I'm still benefiting. So I just wonder how he would differentiate between those two first lines. Like I wonder, that doesn't seem so clear to me. But anyway.
Yeah. Well, maybe there's a certain degree of interpretation involved there, and it's, almost arbitrary, the description of the exact relationship between
Yeah,
and
it would be
among
good
people.
to try and analyze those looking at the pictures themselves, but yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, another part of the narrative structure is the color distinctions that are made. So the black lines are the nucleus of the story. That's how one critic described it. And then anything in red uh, represents restraint of activity. So if some regulating agency puts a stop to this illegal activity, that's in red, Or if someone dies, I think there's a slide we'll see later that describes a mysterious accident in a mysterious death in a fiery car accident. That's in red, right? So that puts a stop to the illegal
Right.
activity.
Again, coming back to Scarface,
All
that's
right.
the car bomb assassination.
Yeah, there you go. This is so fucking bad.
Exactly.
All right, it's so how does he make his idiosyncratic artworks? Well, first of all, he does an enormous amount of research, right? And his parents talk about how he had, well, his parents and I think his agent or his gallery representative and some of his uh, artist friends talk about how he had these pink, yellow, blue, and green index cards. He probably had some kind of system, but it's not clear, you know, what that was, what each color represented. But anyway, there are apparently like 14,000 of these index cards with his meticulous notes. So, an enormous amount of reading of this public information and uh note taking was involved.
Another interruption for a sidetrack. I think you and I are old enough to remember when libraries used what was it called, the Dewey Decimal System?
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
we legit had these long sets of cards. I don't know how much I actively used them, but I was definitely taught to use them. I think we had to like write down, right, the number or something from that, and then take that to the librarian. I don't remember exactly how it worked. How connected were
Well,
you with that whole world?
there was a card catalog. It was a
Right.
card catalog, right? Like the book you wanted was, you had to find like the card. Yes, and I think you took it out of the card catalog and gave it to the librarian, and they would find the book
Or you
for
just
you. Or
copied from
sometimes
it,
you could,
maybe.
yeah, or sometimes you could check it out from the shelf yourself. But I'm thinking of like index cards that I used. Maybe this is before your time, but we used index cards for like research papers, and there was a special way to do it. Like you had to put the you like you would use these index cards for your bibliography that you would submit with your research paper, right? And it had to be formatted a certain way, so you would have all the information about your source at the top of the index card, and then you would have the actual notes with page notations on the index card, and then you would use all the index cards to type up your research paper, right, with
It's
appropriate
crazy just to think about
citations.
scholarship prior to the internet. You know,
Yeah.
how do you
Well,
access
and
articles about your thesis? You just rely on what
Yeah,
your university library has, or what?
yeah, or you do some kind of interlibrary loan. Um,
But how do you even
and
find out
so
about what other universities have?
that's the thing. It was much more difficult, and so he was very much old school, and that's what makes his work more impressive because he was doing this the hard way, right? Like maybe he had some access to internet, in the 90s. Surely he did, but he's still using those old school index cards.
Totally.
But he worked as a librarian, so he would have known like the current methods for obtaining information.
Did that job ever
So
appeal to you? Because I always had
um,
a kind of like a flighting romance with the idea of being a librarian.
librarian, yeah,
Yeah,
sure, yeah, there are worse jobs than that.
sure.
Teaching, for example.
Hey, not sure about that. You should have seen the
All
kind
right,
of chats
so
I had with my students today.
so he then takes the research from these index cards and starts sketching on what one critic calls architect paper. Maybe that's one of his artist friends. So it's like a very thin drafting paper, and he actually uses drafting supplies. I mean, I took some drafting classes in college, and it also reminds me, his tools remind me of like things that I used in geometry class, like a kind of protractor,
Right, and
right? and
compass.
and a thing that you can use to draw circles of various sizes and straight
Yeah, compass,
edges.
bro.
So it's almost like he's a draftsman showing he's a conspiracy theorist that is also a draftsman and represents these power relations visually
And I assume you're saying that
in a way that
facetiously.
an investigative reporter would try to explain them verbally. I mean, he's using words as well. He's using text, but the whole point is the visual representation of the mind map, or sociogram, as you say. I'm thinking like sociopathogram, because a lot of these people were exactly that, criminals of the highest order. All right, so that's how that hopefully that gives people a good overview of how he created this work. And of course, if you're not watching, you'll want to go online and look at some of his work and maybe watch the documentary as well. I just wanted to point out that shortly before his death, there was a sprinkler system accident which damaged, I think it was the BCCI work.
That's right.
And just before like an important exhibition, he had to like redo it in a matter of days. So that was very stressful. This slide here shows, one of the damaged um, sections of the artwork. It really um, defaced the beautiful diagram, and you just wonder, like, really they had a sprinkler system accident. I mean, maybe so, but were there people who didn't want his artwork displayed? Could they have somehow intervened? This screenshot says um, it's one of those red um, sections of the artwork. It says 1985, died in mysterious Houston car fire. So I don't know who this was. Probably someone related to Arbusto Energy, right? W's um, energy company, or Harken Energy, one of those
If you fool me once, you fool
Texas-based
me.
companies. I think
You fool me
Harken
twice.
Energy is
You
from
fool me.
Texas. Go ahead.
No, I was doing a bad George Bush impression. Just go on.
You're either with us or against us.
Exactly.
All right, so as hinted at before, there's a question of how he died. Was it by suicide, as the official version would have us believe, or was he suicided? This slide shows his skeptical mom, who in the documentary talks about how when she went to his apartment, she and her husband, and I think his sister went later, like they were only allowed 10 or 15 minutes in there, and then they were kind of rushed out, and they went back later and stuff had been moved around. Some voice messages had been deleted from his answering machine. So she doesn't believe the official story. She thinks that some powerful people, upset by his artwork, suicided him,
Is that
gave
your
him the
phrase?
old
Have you coined
Epstein.
that?
What, suicided?
Yeah.
No, that's not my coinage. That's commonly used to describe, people like Epstein. He got suicided.
Okay. Nice. I will say that it was. I don't know if odd is the right word, but I'll let you choose the word. Bemusing, maybe, that if she was so convinced that it wasn't a suicide, but she still seemed pretty happy to just kind of sit back in her rocking chair and muse about it rather than like hire a big private investigation team. You know what I mean? It was just like, I don't know, if it's your son and you're really convinced that the government took him out, you'd think you'd make it more of a fuss, but I don't know. Maybe that's unfair. Or maybe that just shows the scale
Well,
of
I
the
mean,
apparatus that she's up against.
yeah, or maybe this documentary gave her an opportunity to publicly express her skepticism about the official story. But anyway, as we wrap up here, um, I just thought I would share some of the artwork of other mostly New York based artists. I mean, a lot of his colleagues and contemporaries, artist friends, were like abstract artists. And I suppose you could say he's an abstract artist too, but the other artists featured in the documentary are more like, I don't know, what I would think of as abstract painters. So there's Greg Stone. You can Google their artwork if you're not watching, but that's an interesting piece. This guy Rafael Vargas Suarez, I really like the stuff of his I've seen online.
It's a really nice piece
Um,
that you featured here.
yeah, there's a Fred Tomaselli who's fairly well known. Some interesting, almost psychedelic or
Yeah.
fantastical artwork. And then I like the patterned artwork of James Sienna. Really nice piece displayed here, and a lot of interesting examples online. So that was a nice thing to. They don't show any of these guys' works. Maybe in the background as they're being interviewed, you can see some of their work on the wall, but if you Google these artists that are mentioned in the documentary, you can find some really nice stuff. Like in a way, I like their work better than his visually. Even though
Well,
I
that leads me
I
to a
like
kind
the
of like
power
a
relations.
question. That leads me to a question that
Mm-hmm.
I've kind of got some more visceral questions, which I can save until you're completely finished. But I kind of want to just kind of cut through the tour guide quality that we're kind of giving this guy and just ask some more blunt questions like, does this guy
Yeah.
belong in the realm of art? You know, it's very arguable in my mind, which is not to discount the value of what he's doing, but he initially describes it as just a hobby, something that he was going to just help him to organize his brain. And then later he reflects and decides, no, actually, this is more interesting than the art I'm producing. And we put it in an art gallery because it's interesting to look at, but that doesn't necessarily bring it into the realm of art for me. What do you think?
Well, I think it's definitely art. I think he created a new form of visual representation, and yes, it does have that documentarian quality. There's like I think it's true that he is kind of a modern version of that um I don't know, Renaissance or medieval history painting genre that the critic mentioned. Um, but
I didn't buy that, but
uh,
anyway.
well, I certainly think
I
it
enjoyed the
belongs
comparison because
in a
it was
museum.
fun, but
Hmm.
I thought it was a stretch.
Well, it doesn't look like it visually, but it's clearly an inspiration, right? Like he
I don't know. I
studied
guess I
this
just
stuff,
want
and I think.
I want more tribute to beauty if you're really going to consider it art. I mean, more aesthetic decision making. Because I mean, okay, some of the ones that you featured in this presentation, like especially that first one, which had that globe shape, it has a certain aesthetic appeal. And when you do pull back and view it from a distance, there's something satisfying about the shapes. But really, this just feels like something like, you know, and I don't want to sound like someone who dismisses modern art. You know, it's like, oh, I can draw that. But, you know, if we take like, who's the famous guy? Rothko, right?
Hmm.
But at least there's something very kind of satisfying about the color, at least in like a Rothko. Uh, whereas here, it's so data driven that it does almost feel just like something you could generate in PowerPoint, and it's interesting because of the facts he's pointing out more so than the aesthetics. Like if you were in front of one of these pieces, you'd be more interested in like reading the names and kind of Googling and seeing what you remember. It would be such a heady experience, such a left brain experience. I don't know. But I that's just one. I'm not like fully committed to that point of view either. It's just it would be cool maybe if it was a bit more beautiful, like the same if the same information was presented in a bit more visually stunning way.
Well, there's something about the um, simplicity and austerity of it, right? Like it's just white, black, red, um, circles and lines and text on a massive scale. So again, it's not either or, it's both
Sure.
and. I can enjoy these more, you know, obviously abstract um artists and their work, but I think he, invented a new kind of abstract art, uh, which is completely unique. And it doesn't bother me that it's data driven. In fact, I would say like in in this world that we live in, even more so now, like before 2000 it was already the case, and now in 2024, like if you're not engaging with what's going on in the world, you're just jerking off, like, which is also fine. If you want to do that, go ahead. But it's
Yeah,
like,
I don't really buy
is
that.
that
I think everything is like a political
if you
decision.
don't grapple if you don't grapple with um like the issues facing all of us today in your art, whether it be literature or the visual arts or music or film, like, is it really that relevant and important? It could be. I'm not saying that
It
it's
could be.
impossible to have art for art's sake now, but I think I'm at this particular time most interested in art or literature that, like, engages with the the very disturbing issues and concerns we're faced with today. But
Kind
that's
of
just
reminds
what
me,
I think.
yeah, it kind of reminds me of a long debate I was having with Carlos the other day. Maybe this would be worth its own pod. And it's just like the eternal debate over like about we were having a debate about the amount of skill necessary, skill versus inspiration kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And whether an artist really needs to be grounded in the fundamentals of art to produce something beautiful. Do they have to work extremely hard on the editing process? And so like if I come back to Lombardi, I guess if he had approached this art and I could sense more, maybe I just need to know more about him. But if it was like he had this vision, right, of like, I'm gonna create this beautiful like contours and circles and movement. But again, it started out as an organizational tool, like the most convenient organizational tool. And then he's like, oh yeah, it kind of works. So I just think that's why I'm like slightly maybe, or I'm just like suspending
Underwhelmed.
my, yeah, slightly. But
Hmm.
but
Well,
either way,
I
he's a
mean,
genius in his own way.
the
There's no doubt. You can watch this and but you see like the the obsessive nature that he takes to information. Like this is a genius. There's no question. I mean, it's kind of reminded me of the like A Beautiful Mind. Even as much as that was like a Hollywood film, but it's just someone who just really got stuck in this way of existing, and we get to see it come to fruition in in these circles, and that's what he can produce. So I don't mean to be condescending. I'm just posing some other questions.
well, I mean, there's a connection between genius and madness, right? Like, what was he mentally disturbed, and is that why he may have committed suicide? Like, that's possible. Like, he was prone to depression, and he was definitely obsessive, right? Like, how else could he have created this work? But the question of technique is, like, always interesting and relevant. How much technique do you need to produce great art? And a pure technician is not necessarily a great artist, right? Like,
For sure.
I'm thinking of, like, musical virtuosos, right? Like the guy who can play a million miles an hour on the
For
guitar
sure. I was making the
and
same
do all the
arguments to
technical
Carlos.
tricks is not always, like, the most moving, powerful, poignant musician.
Yeah. It's a complex topic, and
Yeah,
perhaps we better table
on
that.
the other hand, you do need a certain amount of technique regardless of the art that you practice,
Right.
right? Like,
Right.
you need to be able to construct sentences. If you're a writer, you need to be able to, draw or paint certain basic things. If you're a visual artist, you need to master certain features of the camera if you're a filmmaker, and on and on.
And I think some artists will just will resent people reducing art to inspiration because it's like it reduces the effort that they put in. Like there's this
Yeah.
quote which seems like kind of one of those like fake quotes in a way, but it's Michelangelo talking about the Sistine Chapel, and he says something like, "If people knew how hard I worked, they wouldn't think this was a miracle." You know,
Mm.
like so it's I think
There's
that's kind of Carlos's point too, just the sweat that he puts into the writing process. It's like it's not just some moments of, oh, I see a beautiful woman, I'm inspired to write something. It's like it's the grind. So I think that's the tension.
Yeah, of course. The craft,
Yeah, exactly. But then it's
the
not
effort.
exactly a craft because craft is its own category. So again, we should probably talk about that in a different time and space. Maybe can I just get you to speak a little bit more about why you think what purpose exactly documentation serves for you? Like what satisfaction it brings. I mean, I get art, but maybe there's a distinction to be made between documenting and creating art. So if you want to go with any of those questions, maybe you could talk about that, or do you see there being a difference between documenting and creating art?
Um, to me, it's part of the same process. Like, I don't feel I've fully experienced something until I have documented it in some aesthetic way, whether musically or, you know, as literature, or as you know, I've also done like collage. So I have
I thought about your
dabbled
collage
in.
during this podcast.
Yeah, actually, I did too. Like there, when I was deeply involved in that, it was very obsessive, and like you know, um, including everything that I wanted to include on my rectangular poster board. Right, like there's definitely an obsessive quality to that kind of work.
But look, sorry to interrupt, but like for me, if you're in a place and you're like taking pictures to keep a record, that's kind of more like what I see as documentation. Or like if we're on a trip and you say, okay, I went to this restaurant at this time and I ate this. But that's
No,
not the
no,
same thing
no,
as
of course
making
not.
literature or writing a song. So,
Exactly. Yeah, because but but the basic documentation, let's say the initial documentation of scribbled notes or photographs, then you have to take all that data, since we mentioned data before, and you have to transform it almost like an alchemist. You take all of this dross and uh, transform it into gold, hopefully,
right, right.
through the aesthetic process, right? Like that's how I would describe what what I do. I'm thinking in particular of like my travel logs,
Yeah, but isn't
right?
that the
Like
difference between documentation and art?
I mean, it's transformed, but I still see that as a kind of documentation. I don't want to, you know, make a rigid distinction between documentation and um, aesthetic transformation. To me, it's all the same thing, and I haven't completely experienced whatever I've experienced until I've undergone that complete process. I mean, it's kind of like a painter who I know of many painters who like take photographs of the things they want to paint, and then you know, that's a quite a common practice. I'm even watching a Netflix series now about a painter who does that. Like she takes pictures of male nudes from all these different angles, and then she looks at the pictures, and then she starts painting, right? And um, landscape painters do that as well. Now that we have the invention of photography, right? Like that wasn't possible before, but now it is. And in fact, think of landscape painting before the camera, right? Before photography. Wasn't that just a kind of documentation as well? Like you're just trying to capture the image of this landscape or this panorama or whatever it is. It's a form of documentation.
Yeah, I mean, you're right to blur the lines, and particularly when you talked about the alchemy and the process of the document to the creative product, I can see why the documentation period is vital. And you're also right to just say that the process itself can't be completely separated. However, we do have two terms. So there there is they're not exactly the same either, right? I mean, they exist on a spectrum, but it's worth noting that
Well,
art is more
yeah,
about creation and documentation is more about just kind of
I
getting the
just like
essentials
to
down of the experience.
I just like to think that some of the earliest literature, so called, that we have is basically, you know, archival notations like, so many bales of wheat were stored during the winter, and
Yeah, but I don't
so
want to read
many,
that.
so many cows were slaughtered, for the benefit of whatever Sumerian god.
Yeah, that's boring.
Well, it depends on the context and uh, how much of the text we're given. Sometimes it's fragmentary, and it's the fragmentary nature of it makes it beautiful and interesting to me. Like, I mean, of course, that's not for everyone, but I like reading some of those old, um, you know, inventories that
This
we
reminds me of the
find from
Bible and
from the from the
Genesis.
ancient from the ancient world. Well, exactly,
They
yeah.
start saying this
Like
person is the son of this person. This person is the
gene,
son of this
gene,
person.
genealogies, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, a lot of Greek literature too. Like go back to Hesiod, and you've got like the Theogony, which is basically a genealogy of the gods. Like here's the and the historians, Herodotus, Thucydides. They're just narrating what happened. Of course,
Okay,
there's
but like
art
let's just
involved.
admit that there is some when we say documenting versus creating art, or even when we're talking now, like there is something that feels more documentary,
Okay, but
right?
it start you it
And I'm not
starts
saying that
so,
pejoratively.
it starts somewhere, right? It starts with basic record keeping and uh you know uh documentation of basic facts and data gathering and research. Then sure, you want to do something with it. But I guess that's the challenge to I'm thinking again about travelogues, right? Like if it's not just going to be um like a slideshow of my vacation, there has to be some sort of alchemical or transformative element. But who knows? Maybe it's not always successful, and maybe people would say this shit's boring. It's just like a diary of this guy's vacation. Fair enough, you know. But for me, I'm trying to fully process the experience, whatever I've experienced. Again, if it's a travelogue, I want to fully process that travel experience, that trip, or whatever it is, and make all the connections that I feel like I need to make to fully process that experience. So there's like personal, mythological, historical, cultural
Yeah, and you're creating. You're
aspects.
creating. You're not just you're not
Well, I don't know.
Bartleby the
Maybe
virtuoso.
maybe I'm just connecting dots like Lombardi does, you know.
And that's the only question that kind of persists in my mind is like if we're talking about proportionality, like what proportion of what Lombardi is doing is record keeping versus the magic of making something beautiful and
Well, I
inspiring even to
guess
yourself. But that's up to the viewer.
yeah.
And he's obviously interesting,
I mean,
which is more than we can say for most artists. Sorry.
the fact that we've had all these conversations, I think, is, you know,
Sure.
indicative of something. It shows that his art um inspired us in some way, or provoked us, or, you know,
Well, it's
agitated us.
and I had a couple whiskeys, and I'm desperate for people to enjoy our podcast.
Hmm.
So I'm really trying to add fuel.
Add fuel to the fire.
Burn, baby,
All
burn.
right, tell us what the next text is.
Great. So this is not a request, but I have a private student named Anna who works in the film industry. She actually just got back from the Berlin Film Festival, which you may have read something about because it was in the news. Did you see what happened there?
No.
Like Owen Jones has done a piece on it, but the Berlin Film Festival, among other film festivals, has kind of a reputation of being overtly political. And one of the pieces was made by two Israeli and two Palestinian directors concurrently,
Mm-hmm.
and they gave a pretty impressive speech when they won an award. I think it's called like No Man's Land or something like that. I'll check out the title or we can link it. And the crowd applauded rapturously, and then the people, I think someone from the ministry, the German ministry, applauded, and then she later caveated her applause by saying, "I was only cheering on the Israeli of the two directors," and then the mayor of Berlin said that dismissed the whole festival as anti-Semitic and how could they.
Anti-Semitic, of course.
And now they're changing the director of the whole film festival for next year. So I think in an effort to basically tame its political content, which is crazy. But
All right.
anyway,
Well,
so long story to say that my wonderful student Anna. Sometimes we base our lessons on films, and she has recommended a film called Past Lives, which I have not seen and you haven't seen. And I think that's kind of cool because even if we don't like it, we can go in on it, and
mm-hmm.
so whatever our reaction, it would be cool to gonna both go blind into it. So Past Lives, 2023 film directed by Celine Song. Nora and Hae Sung, two childhood friends, are reunited in New York for one fateful week as they confront notions of destiny, love, and the choices that make a life. So let's get into that
This
film
is a
in our
Korean
next.
film.
Sounds like it. No, maybe not, but
Mm-hmm.
just the two childhood friends, they obviously have Korean names, Nora and Hae Sung. Maybe not. Directed by Celine
Mm-hmm.
Song. I should probably know a little bit more, but that's the fun of the discovery. So,
All right. We'll see.
yeah.
Okay. Well, we had some technical issues,
Yeah, apologies for that.
but maybe we can edit those out in post. We'll see how that goes. Quick reminder, please follow us On Substack, I'm at Mark Will Wright. That's WRITE.substack.com. Tomek is at tomekb.substack.com. And you can watch our videos on my YouTube channel. That's at Mark Will Wright, WRITE. So thanks again. This has been season 3, episode 5 of Texting. Our text was the documentary Mark Lombardi, Death-Defying Acts of Art and Conspiracy. Until next time, bye-bye.
Thanks for listening, everybody.